The story of Ruth and Naomi is a story of hope when everything seems to be hopeless. When all else seems to be lost, we come to this little book in the Bible about Ruth and Naomi and Boaz and just a little 4-chapter Bible book. It's an excellent read. If you've never read it, you want to take the opportunity. Some of you watch TV, but the Bible's much better. Much better. And so let me also tell you at the outset of this particular message, because I don't normally have to give this sort of disclaimer, but today's message at times will be a little bit PG-13. But it's in the Bible, okay? So if you need, I could probably give you a little bit of a warning, anyway. But the story of Ruth is a story of when hope seems to be lost. The family gets kicked out of Bethlehem because of a famine. They go off looking for better territory. They end up in Moab, and it's the family of Elimelech. Now, Elimelech would be the patriarch, and he would have land in Bethlehem, but because he's unable to grow food and able to support himself, they find themselves in Moab, where ultimately his sons find wives and get married. And so that's something that we need to pay close attention to. In the midst of this, Elimelech dies, and then you have, after just 10 years of marriage, both of Naomi's sons die. So you are left with Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. The Bible tells us that they found out that there was food. God was feeding his people again, is kind of how it is put. Back in Bethlehem, they say, okay, it's time to go home. And so they pick up from Moab and they start setting off for home. And the Bible literally says that while they were on the road, Naomi sort of stops and says, wait, hold on. Stop everything. You guys ought to stay here with your families where you can be taken care of. And Orpah says, great, I'll go back to my family. Well, she cries, but goes back to her family. And Ruth says, no, it's not happening. I'm going to cling to you, and I'm not going to let you go. We are stuck together. We will never be apart. Now that's an incredible story in and of itself, right? It's the bottom of the bottom, and where all they have is each other. That's it. That's all they have to really hold on to. So they finally get back to Bethlehem. Word spreads that they're there, and Ruth asks Naomi, because in that sort of culture, Naomi is now the head of the household. They need some men because that's how you make your living back then. You need some men, and you want them to take care of you for the rest of your life. And so Ruth says, hey, can I go glean in a field so that we won't starve to death? And of course Naomi says, no, I'd rather starve. We know better than that. She says, all right, go ahead. And so Ruth ends up in a field. Just by chance, she ends up in a field. And the field she ends up in happens to be that of Boaz, which we find out later belongs to a relative. Boaz is a relative of Naomi. So now things are starting to look up a little bit, right? It's starting to look a little bit better. Boaz helps Ruth and Naomi because he begins to bring glimpses of hope. He tells Ruth, he says, listen, don't go glean in anyone else's field. Don't let me catch you someplace else. You just stick here with me. You stick here where everything is good. And I've already told all the men in my crew that they need to leave you alone. They're not to touch you. They're not to bother you. They're not to do any of those sorts of things. And so you just stay here, and I'm going to take care of you. You just be here through these things. So they are able to eat and to be cared for, even as they continue to have a bit of a struggle. Because again, to ensure in that culture what you're supposed to have, you need men. And you have who? Just Naomi and Ruth. So that's where they find themselves being. My question for us as they begin to get this hope is, when we are hope-filled, what is our responsibility? When maybe you've had the hardest time of your life and you begin to see a little glimmer of hope, or maybe when you've been praying about something for a really long time and you begin to see that maybe God is going to answer that prayer. What is your responsibility in that hope? What is it that God is calling you? You see, at the end of chapter 2, there's a reason for hope. There's this guy named Boaz. He happens to be part of the family. He can be a kinsman or a guardian redeemer. It's perfect. So we know that he's going to sort of help take care of us. It's exciting stuff. If you're Ruth and Naomi. When we finally get to chapter 3, it brings us to Naomi's response to hope. Are you ready? Because we're going to read a bunch of chapter 3 here. 3:1 through 13. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." Now, in today's language would be, I need to get you married off. So that you can go have babies. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, and then go uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor, and she did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do all you ask. All of the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character, and although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as sure as the Lord lives, I will do it. But lie here until morning." We kind of talked a little bit about the book of Ruth is actually about Naomi. And Naomi is concerned with the family's long-term future because Naomi knows that one day she's going to die, and that's going to leave Ruth, who's a Moabite, in the land of Israel all by herself. And that's not going to be a good place for her to be. In fact, it's a really bad place for her to be. So Naomi's sort of sitting there going, this is going to be bad. And just like earlier when she said, hey, look, Naomi, you probably ought to go back to your family. Go back to your mom, and they'll find some way to take care of you. You can get married again, have kids, and everything will be the way it was supposed to be, even though my sons have died. I really think that we have to keep this in mind, that Naomi is seriously considering this long-term thing. And so she's got probably more reason to hope than even Ruth has. Boaz is generous. He's kind to Ruth. But you know what? He isn't going to last forever either, and a family is what Ruth really needs, and ultimately also what Naomi needs. Now, Boaz is also in the position to ensure the long-term future of Naomi and Ruth. If he could, somebody in his household even, marrying Ruth, would change things significantly for them. And so they're seeing that, oh, look, we have the perfect solution right here. You have Boaz, who's really taking care of you already, and he qualifies as a kinsman redeemer of our family. Now, I want to make sure that we're clear. This is the PG-13 part, so if you can't handle it, you're going to have to get up and leave or put your hand over your ears, and I'm charging no extra for this. But Naomi's instructions appear to involve some seductions. Now, I want to make something very clear. It would be normal in the culture of that day for Naomi to be concerned about marrying her daughter-in-law off, or her daughter for that matter. So it's not like it's something totally weird or unusual. If you can take your mind into that culture, what she's really saying to Ruth is, look, it's time for you to go, and look, we may have some hope in Boaz. And then she kind of says, here's how we're going to make this work. Here's how you're going to do it. Again, I want to make sure that we understand Naomi's concerned for her own future, but she's also wanting Ruth to be taken care of, not just for right now, but for generation after generation after generation. So she's saying, look, you need a husband. This whole thing is working out great. Boaz is taking wonderful care of us, but it would be so much better if you were married off. Again, right? So here are some of the things about this sort of seductive scene. And the first thing I would kind of mention is Ruth's appearance. Did you catch what Naomi's telling her to do? Take a bath. You kind of stink, and we want you to be really smelling good and clean. Put on some perfume. Dress really nicely, right? Are you catching on to the picture here? Boaz doesn't know it, but he's going on a date. He's about to go on a date. He thinks he's working, but he's about to go on a date. Then there's this business of once he's laid down, go and uncover his feet. There's only one problem with that. If you're a biblical scholar, you know that anytime you see uncovering your feet, you have to really pay attention. Because uncovering feet is actually a euphemism for uncovering something else. So the biblical scholars study this forward and backwards and forward to see, do you think that they really were supposed to uncover her feet? Or his feet? Do you think that's really what it's about? Because almost always, in the biblical language, you get this uncovering feet, it actually means we're going to uncover the genitals. I warned y'all, and you stayed. Some scholars will say, yes, it was his feet. Others will say, well, yeah, okay. Then Ruth asks to be covered when he wakes up and says, who is this woman down here? Like he doesn't know. She says, would you cover me with the corner of your cloak, or in some translations it says with your skirt or with whatever else. Don't misunderstand that at all. Really what this is a marriage proposal. Okay. Some of you don't believe me. I could give you books. It's a marriage proposal. You can't just come out and say, hey, would you marry me? You know, I'm kind of in this situation. And Boaz takes it as a marriage proposal. If you really get down to it, he understands exactly at the end of the story what she wants. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But the fact that Ruth's saying, hey, listen, would you cover me with your cloak? You're a kinsman redeemer. All of these sort of things. There's no doubt what she's getting at. Let's get hitched. I don't want to be your servant girl anymore. I don't want to be the one that just sort of follows the men around and gleans your field and goes back to Naomi. You are the one who's in a position to help us out. That's really a big part of it. But that would be enough, but there can also be a euphemism for intercourse coupled with other language in the narrative. Some scholars will tell you yes, some scholars will tell you no. It's up to you. Use your imagination. Not now, do it later. I'm preaching. The next thing is the word when he says, lie here till morning. So you have, first off, this idea of stay the night here. And there's a lot of things that are really important about that, stay the night here. Lie here until morning. Lie here, or to be with, have sexual connotations in the Bible. You've probably not heard that for the first time today if you've been in the church very long. If you have those sorts of languages, it's just a really nice way and a sort of subtle way so that the kids who are listening don't quite understand what we mean when you say he was with her. Right? But in the text, oftentimes there are implications there. But Boaz could also have had Ruth's safety in mind. Now, if Ruth has traveled to where Boaz is, and she has spent half the night with him, and he finally wakes up, and she gets to ask his question, which is, hey, would you marry me? And he's already said, yes, I'll do it. That he might go, well, I'm not going to send you back home now. It's the middle of the night. You're going to get mugged. You're going to get murdered on your way back home. And then my new wife who came and seduced me into marrying her in the middle of the night. Sometimes I wonder. Questions might arise about Boaz's condition during the events. You might have caught on. Naomi says, wait until he's done eating and drinking. Now, you may not know this, but drinking means either drinking like water or like the harder stuff that we would never, ever, ever there's a talk about in church, right? You said it out loud. So she says, wait until he's finished drinking, and the Bible says he was in good spirits. Woo! I did a lot of research into this. Good spirits could be a really good mood. Just really happy about life. I was sitting here, winnowing the barley or whatever, and on the threshing floor, and just had my dinner and a nice iced tea, and hey, I'm really happy. Life is good. But some people use that same sort of word for, I've had probably more than I should have had to drink, and I'm really happy now. Don't know about morning, but right now. Right? So the implication could very well be that Boaz is drunk. But here's one thing that scholars really struggle with, the idea that he's drunk. Typically, in the Old Testament, when somebody is getting drunk, it just comes out and says it. Just comes out and says it. And it never says that he's drunk when he is in this particular condition. But the implication could be there. And the person who wrote the book of Ruth gives us very little detail about the actual story. Clearly, he is less concerned with the idea of whether or not they had intercourse that night. He's less concerned about whether or not Boaz is drunk. He's less concerned about the maybe seductive sort of way in which this whole thing takes down. And he's way more concerned in telling us the story about how Naomi and Ruth got to be restored and that their hope came back. I want to make sure we're clear on that. One of the greatest things about chapter 3 is that Boaz accepts responsibility for Ruth. Did you catch that? Yeah. It's a done deal. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now, he may have been startled awake by a woman down at his feet. I almost said, did that happen to anyone here? But I'm afraid some of you would say yes. Startled awake. He right away understands what she's looking for and right away says, yes, absolutely, I'm going to take care of you. Now, he does mention that there's another redeemer. There's somebody else who is a closer relative than I am, who is more likely, or who really is the one who, according to the laws of the time, should be marrying you. So he says, I'm going to check into this, and if it doesn't work, I promise you, I forget the exact wording, but that as the Lord lives, or something like that, that I will make sure that you are married off by tomorrow at this time. That's basically what he's saying. And so he tells Ruth, you're taken care of. You guys were at the bottom, absolutely hopeless, and you got a little bit of hope that you got to come back to Bethlehem, or Naomi got to come back to Bethlehem, and then got to eat again, and now everything is going to be restored, even though you're a foreigner, a widow, and all of those things. I want to tell you this. It's possible that both Ruth and Boaz have other people in their mind as they're making these decisions. I want to make sure you get that, because it's so important to the story that this isn't just about Ruth. I told you in week 1, and I told you 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to tell you again today, the book of Ruth is not about Ruth. It's about Naomi. And so the motivation is not necessarily that they're just in love. It's not like you read the story and it's like one of our modern love stories where I don't know, maybe she hit him in the cart in the grocery store. And they fell in love. I'm not mentioning any names, but I saw a bunch of people point to them. I think Ruth would have Naomi in mind. I mean, if you step back and you think about it, Ruth, through this whole thing, isn't thinking of herself. If she was truly thinking of herself, way back in chapter 1, when Naomi says, hey, let me release you back to your family, she'd have said, oh, thank God. Oh, this would be so awesome. I was worried I would have to live with you as a foreigner in a faraway land and a widow, and there's hope. No, she doesn't do any of that. She clings to Naomi. So I'm thinking that Ruth is saying, all right, Naomi, if this is what you tell me to do and this is what's going to work, I'll do it. Now, there's some information here that Boaz sorts of gives us. And he basically says, you haven't run around after the younger men who, whether they be rich or poor, probably had an interest in her. You follow that? Yep. That this whole time it's been about, I'm going to do what Naomi wants me to do. And Boaz says, wow, you're some special person. Why? Because you keep thinking about Naomi. You keep thinking about Naomi. I think some of those other men probably would have even proposed. Said, hey, let me cover you with my cloak, or whatever that strange way of saying it is. Right? I think that's possible. But Ruth would remain under Naomi's authority only if she marries a kinsman redeemer. Do you follow what I'm trying to say here? Yeah. Marrying anyone else but Boaz or a kinsman redeemer puts Naomi as an outsider. And Ruth has already come so far with Naomi, she's not going to abandon her here. So I'm convinced that as Ruth is thinking through what Naomi has told her to do and what she feels like God wants her to do, I'm convinced that she's thinking all about Naomi. maybe it would be nice to be married again. I don't know. I think Boaz has a very specific person in mind, and I think that was Naomi. After all, if the book is written in a way that kind of tells us about how Naomi was doing in this whole thing, it makes sense that that's the opinion we get. Everyone in town knows that Ruth is of noble character. She is a woman of worth. And why does everyone in town know that? Because word has spread in town that Ruth has stayed with Naomi, even though Naomi gave her the freedom to go. Yeah. So Ruth sticks with Naomi, who is a widow who would be unable to care for herself. And in the midst of that, everybody in town gets word, and what did they say? Wow. Wow. That's incredible. What a neat thing for her to do. What an incredible thing to make happen. And I want to point out that Boaz is thinking, I'm getting a real good woman here. But I think his main concern as he's talking and as the words that are coming out of his mouth seem to be, we'll take care of Naomi through Ruth. Through Ruth. You see, these things are interlinked. I don't know if any of you had to follow an older sibling through school. I've heard some stories. It only happened to me once, where I had to be have the same teacher as my sister, who was a much better student than I am. Not saying that she's smarter. She's a much better student. I call her my much older sister. It's like 18 months difference, but it doesn't matter. That's much older. She's the oldest sister I have. But you know how sometimes that family link, oh, so you're so-and-so's little brother. Well, is that good or is it bad? You must come from a good family. You must be really smart. You're mistaking me for my sister, but that's all right. You see, this is kind of how I see this whole thing. How incredible that you have done this for Naomi. Somebody needs to take care of you. Makes her more attractive even than the clothes or the perfume. I want to remind you that Boaz does not have an obligation to redeem Ruth or Naomi. He's already out of the household. However, he is related to them. Since he's not in their immediate household, the deal is off for him. And plus, he's told us, he's given us the information that there's actually another Redeemer who's closer than he is. But he's saying, even though I don't have the obligation, I'm going to do this. Yeah. If the person who's supposed to do it won't, to make sure that everything is taken care of. Now, however we interpret this story, it's absolutely clear, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, that Naomi's hope is going to be fulfilled by Boaz. Yep. We could stop talking about this right here and go, well, isn't that cool? Because whether she marries this other guy or whether she marries Boaz, you know Boaz is going to look after them. Right? Yeah. And so no matter how this turns out, what was beginning as this absolutely hopeless, broken story is now showing us it's going to be redeemed, that things are going to be okay, that things are going to go well for Naomi and Ruth once again. Right. Yeah. Regardless of how you look at some of those things in the middle, Ruth actually gets to come back, and she brings Naomi a gift from Boaz. This is after what we read. You can read it later, not now, I'm preaching. But he insists when she does leave to go back to Naomi, he insists that Ruth take her 6 measures of barley. So she comes back to Naomi with a gift. Here, I'm going to take care of you. Here, everything's going to be okay. Here, this is going to be wonderful. In No matter what, your future is secure. Some of you are not as excited about this as you ought to be. So she brings this. Naomi's assured of a future. Now, do you remember chapter 1? She'd lost her husband, both of her boys. They were without food. They were in a famine. Oh my goodness. And now, not only is there going to be a new marriage, she's going to be reunited and back in the kind of family she wants to be in. But did you notice how now she has more than enough because Ruth comes back with a gift of nothing else but food? Yeah, okay. Someday. One of the things that absolutely amazes me about this story is you have right now this incredible moment of excitement that comes from a broken family in a bitter place. Remember bitter? Yeah. That Naomi comes back into Bethlehem and people are like, "Oh, Naomi, it's so good to see you." And she goes, "Hey, stop calling me that because the Lord has made my life bitter. Call me bitter." Yeah. I'm wondering if by now she's gone back to Naomi. God's restoring me. It's good again. I want to point out that this all starts with Ruth's commitment to hope. From the very beginning, when there was no possibility, Ruth clings to Naomi and says, "I will hope with you, and I will be with you to make sure everything goes okay." That's exciting news. That's exciting times. It continues with that glimpse of hope that we got with Boaz. And when Boaz sees and says, "Hey, look, who is that woman?" "Oh, that's Ruth." "Oh, the one that's been with Naomi. And let's make sure she stays here and only gleans from our field. And tell all the guys that if they touch her, they're going to have to answer to me." Yeah. Hope is becoming what it needs to be. So my question for us this morning was that when we are hope-filled, what is our responsibility? What is it that we are supposed to do? First thing I want to point out is that hope demands our participation. It is not enough to just say, "I have hope." If you look at Ruth each step of the way as she says, "Hey, I've got hope," she does something. That's right. And it's not the kind of something that just forces something through. You know, we do that sometimes. I hope this works out really well, and now we're going to try to force it through. Be no doubt that Naomi was hopeful that Boaz will marry Ruth and restore the family. And when the point at which we had read, Naomi doesn't know yet. But Naomi's saying, "Look, I have hope that this is going to happen. So we got to do something. We got to make something happen." But she's not just going to sit back and go, "Well, how are things going with you and Boaz? Are they going well? How about you hurry this along a little bit?" is kind of what she says. And she does it in a totally different way. But we can't always sit and wonder how hope will be fulfilled. Have you ever gotten a glimpse of hope in your life and then just sort of sat there and said, "I wonder if this is going to work out? Let me just sit here and think about it for a while. Let me just sit here and do nothing." I hope that by the end of this year that we will have expanded our ministry at Desert Grace. How far are we going to get if I just sit here and hope? Let me grab the stool. I'll just sit and hope for a while. How's it coming? I didn't hear what he said. No. We have board meetings and we talk about what our hope is and we vote on what our hope is and we move forward on things. We don't just sit. It might seem kind of weird that Naomi tells her daughter-in-law, who's a widow, to go seduce a man. Seduce might be a little strong of a word. But to go talk to this man and kind of move that hope along. But at the same time, We can't just sit and hope. One of the things that I'm convinced of is that hope demands that we act on God's hope for us.
Amen.
Now, I will tell you, one of the things I wish was in the book of Ruth, and I wish that we could read through it, is that God said to Naomi, God said to Ruth, God said to them, or God wanted them to do that. But I got to tell you that sometimes God doesn't come down and say, look, I know you've got some hope. Now here's what you must do. Go over to Boaz. Sometimes God leads us to do something, and sometimes through other people. And how do we know that it was God? We almost always do at the other end. When we can look back and go, oh, God's hand was in that. So what Naomi tells Ruth to do, I am convinced, is God's hope for Ruth and God's hope for Naomi. I just wish it said it right in there. You see, sometimes we have hope that something might happen when God has another plan. And sometimes we have hope that something will happen and God's plan is laid out in front of us. Both of those things are true. And we got to be careful about how we handle both of them. We want to follow what we know God is asking us to do as closely as we can. And if we begin to realize that this is me trying to make this happen, we got to stop. Hold the horses. I want to point something out if I haven't already. It's clear that there's time that has passed between chapters 2 and chapters 3. So you have this whole thing with Ruth coming back and reporting to Naomi that there's this guy named Boaz. He's the guy who owns the field. He's the guy who's doing this. And then she says, hey, this could be a possible thing. Then you have chapter 3 starting. And what does it begin with? One day, Naomi was sitting there thinking that, hey, I got to marry my daughter off. Didn't happen, on Tuesday she met Boaz. On Wednesday, this plan was called into action. In other words, I would take that one day as God's leading. God one day led her to do this. And I don't think that Naomi is sending out Ruth on a glimmer of hope without having considered the consequences. Do you realize that if God's not in this, just as much as Boaz said, look, I will redeem you, he could have said, you crazy woman, you're a Moabite, you're a foreigner, I don't like you, you smell funny, that's the worst perfume ever, and you aren't even welcome here anymore. Naomi's considered it, so I'm convinced that Naomi is listening to what maybe God is leading her to do. So we've got to make sure that when we have hope, that we're not just running out and doing our own thing, but that we're seriously seeking God first. Right. Yeah. I think that's so important. I also want to point out that we can't just analyze hope and the potential action that we need to do to the point that we will be paralyzed. I think one of the biggest challenges we have sometimes is that God gives us these incredible visions of what we could do, and we begin to get hope. What could we become as a church or as a person? How many people could we reach for the sake of Jesus Christ? And then we start going, well, that's a really great thing to hope for. And then we start to worry about what's going to happen if we begin to act. I'll tell you, what we're talking about doing as a church, I'm real hopeful that we'll reach people for Jesus Christ. And I don't mean one or two. I mean lots.
Right. Yeah.
But it'd be real easy to go, oh, this looks hard. Oh, this is really big. Oh, we're never going to be able to do this on our own. All that is true, by the way. But when God is with it, we have hope. Naomi is so sure it becomes an action that she is sure of. We must be responsible to keep hope always. As I'm thinking about this story and as I'm thinking about what we've read, and I begin to wonder, how fearful would Ruth have been? Naomi is sending her in, and there's the rejection that could occur. There's we might not have something to eat the next day that could occur. There's all these different things that might have happened. And what do we get? We don't get any of that. It doesn't seem like any of that is part of the story. It seems like the story is that Ruth goes in and she says, this is what the hope is built on. This is what the action we're supposed to take. Why would I be afraid? What is there to be afraid of? Sometimes we begin to lose our hope because we're afraid that things aren't going as well as we'd like them to go. And I think we need to be really careful of that. I don't think we need to be fearful. Is our hope misplaced? Because if it's not in God, we can become really fearful really quick. If your hope for the future is on you, it might be a problem. I think sometimes hope makes us sad because I think a few times we start to get hope and we go, wait, it's too late. Or that it brings back bad memories. Don't you think Ruth had a little bit of a thought about, oh my goodness, I'm going to be married again? I remember my first husband. I remember my life back in Moab. I remember this. I remember that. And she's got to keep the hope alive. She's got to keep hoping that everything's going to be great. I think sometimes hope makes us feel unworthy. I wonder sometimes if Ruth might have thought, even for a little bit in the back of her head, that I'm not worthy to be married to Boaz. I'm not even an Israelite. And what does Boaz say about her? You're a woman of great worth. Hope is emotion-filled. It's both good and bad emotions. I think sometimes hope makes us fearful. Hope makes us sad. Hope makes us feel unworthy. Hope makes us feel worried about the future. And yet at the same time, hope is why we continue living. I don't know. But I'm convinced that hope must always reign. Regardless of what setbacks we might see or concerns we might have. I'm convinced that in the midst of hope, we must seek God in that hope and then act as God leads us to act. I hope you hear what I'm saying. There is something that we must do. It's not as simple as just sitting back and going, I can hope. But there's something that we must go out and we must do, and that God calls us to do to bring His will to reality. And yet if we don't seek God, everything we do might be only of us. And we will miss what God has for us when we do that. That's so important. You see, this is where all of our hope becomes the greatness of God's plan in our lives. Do you know God has a plan for your life? Sometimes I think people aren't convinced that God has a plan. Are you hopeful about what that plan is?
Amen.
Because God wants to use you in incredible ways. Are you active with God in the midst of your hope? I don't know what you're hopeful for today. I hope you're hopeful for something. If it's that the sermon's going to end, it's coming right now. But whatever you hope for, you'd better seek God in getting it to come around. To not just hope, but hope realized. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity to gather here today. We thank you for what you've done for us, and for the hope that you give us, and for the word that you've shared with us this morning. Let us leave this place as hopeful people, but also as people determined to act in ways that you've called us in order that we might be able to just live into your will. Lord, as we leave this place, may we be reminded of what you have said through your word, what you say through one another. And Lord, let us have hope that is just so contagious to a world around us. Lord, be with us as we leave this place. Guide us, direct us, bring us back safely to worship together once again. We pray all of this in your name. Amen.